welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Frank Martella, it is so wonderful to be able to have you on Meaningful Work Matters. I'm quite excited for this conversation. Your research on meaningful work has been quite an inspiration in terms of the way that I've thought about meaningful work, the way that I've thought about broad purpose more generally. The research that you've done has certainly been very useful in surveying the field and helping those of us who work and study in this space have an understanding of the huge breadth of work that's here, let alone you are prolific in all sorts of well-being territory and are a wonderful person within the positive psychology community more broadly. So I'm thrilled to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Yeah, great to be here. And great to talk about this topic that we both are excited about.
Perhaps we can start by you just introducing yourself a little bit, telling us a little bit about you and what makes your work meaningful.
Yeah, so I work as assistant professor here at Aalto University in Finland. And I've been doing my research is mainly about meaningfulness, well-being, happiness, these kind of topics, both in life in general, but then especially in the work context. So I've been studying this both from the point of view, organizational research, but also from the psychological point of view, and also done some philosophical work on the topic, because I feel that the topic like meaningfulness is something that you have to approach from many different angles to get it right or get broad enough lens on it. And I guess what makes my own work meaningful, I guess myself, I enjoy quite much thinking about these deep questions. So I'm quite grateful to be able to do that as my work. So I'm quite happy every morning when I'm able to start it with opening my laptop, having a coffee next to me, and starting to write some scientific or popular article. So I wouldn't know what would be more exciting thing to do as a work. So I guess that's one part of the meaningfulness of my own work. And then the other part is that I feel that through doing this work, I'm able to contribute to something in the world. So contributing to the scientific community, but also then trying to contribute to the general population through these ideas about how to make one's work more meaningful.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I feel like it segues pretty perfectly into some of the research that you've done on what constitutes meaningful work. You and Pessy did this great comprehensive review of all of the research that had been done on meaningful work back in 2018. And one of the key things that you definitely discovered in that process is that there are a lot of different ways that people have defined and measured meaningful work. And of course, one thing that we know about that literature is that since 2019, the year after you published that article, literally half of everything that has been written on the topic of meaningful work has been published since then. So I'm sure that there's many more than I think 36 different definitions that you came up with at that point of meaningful work that are now floating around in the literature on the topic. Maybe can you just start by telling us a little bit about what you found in that article and any other kind of work that you've done related to it since?
Yeah, and that was kind of a parallel article that I was writing with this Mike Steger about definitions of meaning in life at the same time. So I was that point I was kind of starting my career in the topic. So then I was trying to figure out what are we actually talking about when we talk about meaning in life? What are we actually talking about when we talk about meaningful work, and trying to make sense of that. And then I had this feeling that, hey, actually, this one researcher seems to be talking about this thing. This other researcher seems to be talking about something completely different. And because of that, they're kind of talking past each other. So because of that, I felt that, I had I guess one reason to write this paper was just trying to make sense to myself, what actually am I studying when I want to study meaningful work. So that was kind of the original motivation, was just personal sense making of the field. But of course, then I thought, okay, it might serve other people as well if I try to write about that topic. So then with Mike Steger, we wrote this piece about meaning in life and 3 dimensions of that. And then with Anne-Birgitte Pess, we wrote this paper about meaningful work and the 3 dimensions to that. And that was our way of trying to identify the key themes that seem to be emerging from this different definitions.
And my understanding of those 3 different dimensions of meaningful work that you came out with were basically an overall significance in work in terms of what makes work worthwhile. And then 2 kind of subcomponents of that, one being about self-realization and the other being about broader purpose. I mean, you just talked a little bit about the self-realization, about being able to sit down and think about deep questions, and the broader purpose in terms of, how you contribute to the world more broadly with the work that you do. So that's at least my reading of the ways in which you've summarized it. But maybe you can give us a little bit of a deeper perspective.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess like in the most broad terms, I guess like the meaningful work means that, work that you find somehow like valuable and significant, that you find something of value from there, that you don't just, I guess like, one way of like conceptualizing is to say that you find something else from the work than just the fact that you get money from that. That if the only reason that you work, the only value you find from your work is that, okay, if I do this for 8 hours, I get this and this many dollars, then your work is quite meaningless. But then anything like beyond that, if you feel that, hey, this is a place where I'm able to express myself, this is a place where I'm able to connect with other people, this is a place where I'm able to contribute and help other people and so forth. All of these are then the factors that actually make the work meaningful, and the way and that means that they're kind of like making the work valuable as such, that there's some intrinsic value in the work itself. So that's kind of like we were like arguing that this is kind of like the most broadest way of understanding meaningful work, this sense of intrinsic value of the work. And then we like identified these 2 subcomponents that are quite often discussed as like key parts of this meaningful work. One of them is the self-realization, which is exactly about being able to somehow do things that you yourself find interesting, feeling that you're somehow able to engage in the things that are valuable from your own point of view. So in my case, it's like, for example, the fact that I'm able to sit down and write, and I'm able to have these conversations with other people who are excited about the same topics. These are all factors that make it feel that this is something where I'm able to realize myself and my deepmost interests. And then the other like subcomponent, and then it's about this like broader impact and this broader purpose of work, that feeling that when that it's not only about yourself, but it's also about being able to somehow contribute to something beyond yourself, like help other people or contribute to solving some big problem of the humanity or something like that. So in that sense, one way of like saying that the self-realization and broader purpose, that the work has to be like, has a connection to yourself, but then it also has to have a connection to the other people. So if both of these are present in work, then it usually feels quite meaningful.
Okay, so I have a positive psychology geek question. I was just at a conference that was at Stanford, a small kind of meeting, a consensus conference. That was all about trying to figure out what is the singular definition of purpose, and how would you measure it? And this was a conference that was a meeting that was hosted by William Damon, a very prominent person in the purpose space, and folks like Carol Riff were there, and many others who really focus deeply on this question of purpose. And one of the things that has always confused me is the fact that meaning and purpose seem to be constantly joined at the hip. Your definition of purpose includes meaning. Bill Damon's definition of purpose, your definition of meaning includes purpose. Bill Damon's definition of purpose includes meaning. How do you see the relationship between those 2 things?
Yeah, I guess like now purpose is a bit more like, future oriented in my mind. So like I kind of like would argue that, that meaningfulness is this general sense of value that we find in our life as such, or in our work, whether we talk about meaning in life or meaningful work. And then the purpose is like one key way that we find this value in our life or in our work. Because like purpose is this more future oriented goals that I have in my life, at my work, that I find like somehow valuable. And that's usually like one key way of like finding meaningfulness. But then there's like other ways of finding meaningfulness. Like if I go and hang out with my friends in the park when it's sunny outside, that might be a meaningful moment to me, being able to share that moment with good friends or family. But there isn't like any like, broader purpose to that. We are not like, trying to accomplish something. We are not like trying to build something or anything like that. It's just the moment itself is meaningful. So in that sense, in my view, the meaningfulness is the more broader concept. It's like includes all of those things that make life feel valuable, all of those things that make work feel valuable. And then purpose usually is one of the key components that tends to make life meaningful and tends to make work feel meaningful.
Hmm.
And I guess in the work context, it's especially important because work usually involves like doing something, having some projects. And because of that, you want to have that feel that the projects actually are building some value in the world in some one way or another.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. I feel like Bill's definition of purpose is an active commitment to accomplishing something meaningful to the self and of consequence to the world beyond the self, which, there's a lot of good parallels, but it's that active commitment part, the actual doing, which is probably something that we'll talk about much more. So
exactly. I think like that's the thing that I guess like separates meaningfulness and purpose from each other. That this active component of doing something, that's only about purpose, but like meaningfulness can come from also moments which don't have like any active moment or active like purpose like that in themselves.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for helping me geek out for that moment of definitional complexity.
That sounded an interesting conference. I would wanted to be there to hear what kind of opinions people had around the topic.
It was really interesting. It was amazing. Your name was definitely evoked. One of the things, for those who've listened to this podcast before, and if you've read some of the things that I've written about meaning, one of the things that I'm always really curious about is the dark sides of things that we generally think of as really, really good and that we want more of. And we know that within the meaningful work literature, lots of good things happen when people are engaged with meaningful work, but there are potentially also dark sides of that. So have you seen that in any of the literature that you've reviewed around potential dark sides, or can you have too much meaning specifically in the work context, and any kind of senses, if so, about what safeguards us from that?
I guess like I would say that, having too much meaning as such, like it's not the bad thing, but sometimes it can lead to these like trade-offs, which are like bad. So there was this one paper about this, like these zookeepers in the US, like, and then kind of like the employer was like able to make the work conditions like worse and worse because they knew that, the people are so committed to the animals, they're so committed to their current workplace that they wouldn't be quitting even though their work conditions got worse and worse. So like normal people with like less commitment to their work, who would find their work less meaningful, would already at that point say that, no, I quit, I go and work somewhere else. But these people, because they found their work so meaningful, they didn't have like a similar choice in a sense of like quitting, but they were like too committed to the work. So I guess like that's one of the dark sides of meaningful work, that some people might be able to exploit that in situations where you're negotiating about your salary or something like that.
That makes a lot of sense. And for those who are listening, we've had an episode with Jeff Thompson, who, along with his collaborator, Stuart Bunderson, talked about the zookeepers and the work on the dark sides of calling. And so take a listen to that episode to hear Jeff describe it.
Yeah. And I guess that other thing is also that, that in terms of like time commitment, that if you find your work very meaningful, it might be that, you put your whole time into that, which might not be like, it might be that your family doesn't like that, for example, that it would be better from their point of view if you would find your work a bit less meaningful, and because of that, spend a bit more time with them. I guess like my general answer is that, the meaningfulness as such usually isn't a bad thing, but it can lead to these trade-offs where you're like, because of you're so committed to the meaningfulness that you actually then come to neglect some other dimensions of your life, which then makes it a bit worse situation.
So let's just move into the realm of from deep thinking into practical application. I'm curious, how would you translate some of this research and guidance around meaningful work, and specifically, I guess, these kind of three dimensions that you've talked about in terms of kind of what makes work valuable for you? How do you potentially self-realize, and how do you think about broader purpose? How does that translate into the actual experience of work for if there's a leader or a practitioner who's working to try to make more meaning at work? What do you think that means?
Yeah, I guess like usually I advise that, then thinking about this, one topic is like this self-realization. Another topic is this like this broader purpose. Like think about these, like how much they are like present in the current work and what could be done to make them more present in the work is quite usually a good way of like starting. No matter what you're thinking about your own work and how to make your own work more meaningful, or whether you're a leader who thinks that how to make people's work meaningful. So I guess like especially this purpose, having this like positive impact through your work seems to be a theme that quite many people are seeking in their work life. They want to feel that, their work is having some positive contribution. And as regards that, like one thing is, of course, like the actual contribution. Sometimes you can do things that, make the actual contribution larger. But the other thing is also that this like work design can make the contribution more visible. So sometimes there might be a situation that your work is contributing towards certain people, but you never see those people. And because of that, you cannot miss out on the purpose of your work that is already there. So then if some design is done to the work so that it will become more visible, then that will be already helpful. I remember Adam Grant had this example of some I think it was this John Deere tractor factory, that the engineers in the factory, they rarely see the customers. They're at the factory, but then they had this new custom, that whenever somebody have ordered a new tractor, then it was actually somebody from the factory who came to deliver the key to the person. So they would actually see how delighted this farmer or whoever was when they got their new John Deere tractor. So that was one way of making sure that people see the impact of their work better and see the people who they're actually helping through their work. So these kind of design things can already be quite helpful. But then, of course, if you think about your own point of view, then think about your career, how to make sure that the next steps of your career might go in direction where there's more positive impact. Might be also a good way of in the long term to make sure that your career is contributing to something positive.
Before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about Finland being one of the happiest countries, and some of the reasons for that being ultimately a lot to do with public policy. And certainly in the research that I've done on meaningful work, it seems to be very much an ecosystem solution. So there's not a single silver bullet that makes work meaningful. There are definitely things that you can do as an individual to create a bigger sense of significance and self-realization and purpose. There's definitely things that the organization can do, like job design or the way that leadership happens or the kinds of values an organization might have. Do you think that there's things at the policy level, at the broader government level, that can happen to increase the likelihood of meaningful work?
Yeah, I would think so, because now that I think about when I've been trying to identify some this vanguard organizations which are doing things very well in terms of meaningfulness and in terms of motivating the workers and so forth, then quite often these for example, Finland, quite often these IT companies tend to be companies which are doing things very well. And one reason is that that the competition for the best talent is very fierce in that field. So because of that, then the companies have to provide all these these policies, provide all of this very much autonomy to the employees and so forth, because that's the only way to attract the best people to their company. So in a way, I guess the bargaining power of the employees makes a difference in terms of how much meaningfulness they're able to experience. The more they have bargaining power, the more they can choose what kind of work conditions they have, and they then make sure that the work conditions are such that they're actually able to experience more autonomy, more self-realization, and through that, more meaningful work. And I guess the government policies can quite much influence the bargaining power of the different parties. And I guess there might be different between, for example, the US and Finland as regards how much government has done going to level the field in that sense and support the workers in bargaining negotiations with the employer.
Well articulated. Thank you. It's a good segue to a slightly different topic, certainly connected, but a paper that you gave me a little bit of a sneak peek of that you're working on, which is around a new model of well-being that you've articulated, which I think is a very, very cool way of thinking about and framing about well-being. You talk about this version of well-being having 4 dimensions: having, loving, doing, and being, and each of those dimensions is very much predicated on certain kinds of human needs. And I'd love for you to break that down for us. But I guess I use that as a bit of a segue because, the way that you start talking about that paper is the fact that there's so much more public policy interest in this topic of well-being. And it feels like we really need to be having good answers as to what well-being is if governments are really starting to pay attention.
Yeah, and that it's true that, in the last bit more than 10 or the last 15 years, there has been quite much breakthrough in this area. That used to be the case that governments were not paying too much attention to this subject in well-being research or anything like that. But I think somewhere around 2009, there were these few influential conferences, and then the president of France at that time, they ordered this one report about the topic, and the title was something like Beyond GDP, how to measure national progress. And I guess it started from this realization that this GDP, which had been since the World War II, it had been the de facto goal of the governments was to increase the GDP. And at some point, quite many governments were realizing that even though the GDP might be still increasing, it didn't seem the case that, the people's well-being was increasing. And because of that, they felt that, we need some like more direct measures of well-being. So I guess like there was like this kind of like realization going on in policy circles around like 50 years ago. And that led to then like, many countries adopting this national level well-being annual measures and something like that. And because of that, nowadays we have like much more data on the topic. And when we have data on the topic, we can have like much more research results about what are actually the things that are driving well-being on a national level, which again like then like feeds more into the policy circles that they get like more interested in this. So then there's like governments like New Zealand, which introduced this like when they well-being budgeting. So like when they're making these budgeted decisions, they're not only looking at the economic impact of certain budgeted decision, but also the well-being impact of the decision to make sure that the government policies are not only serving the economy but also serving the people. And this is some seems to be going on in quite many countries right now.
One of the ways in which governments around the world ultimately try to see how they stack up is things like the World Happiness Report, which is done often, I think, in collaboration with Gallup. And they largely fall on a model of well-being that's called subjective well-being, a Diener's model, which basically looks at, I think, life satisfaction, how well do you evaluate your life, as well as how much basically positive emotion and how little negative emotion do you have, and kind of create a little bit of a model around that. Seems to be the way that many governments at this point are measuring well-being. Why do we need another model of well-being that
so usually when it's measured on the government or national level, usually it's like then it's this life satisfaction is the only question that they right now seem to be in the most cases asking. So for example, this World Happiness Report is based on just one question. So they have like this so-called country ladder is the name of this life satisfaction question. So think about your life on a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is the worst possible life, 10 is the best possible life. Where would you put yourself on this ladder? That's a question. They ask that from like a representative sample of people in 140 different countries, and then they calculate the averages, and then they rank the countries based on that. And I'm kind of like arguing that, if you only have space for one question in a well-being survey, then by all means use that one, because like that's the one that we have like most data around. That's the question that we have like most consensus around, and that's a question we have like we know mostly about like what it influences or what is influencing it. But then I guess that it still leads to a bit like a narrow view of people's happiness if you only ask about this general life satisfaction. But then there's like much less consensus about like what are the other questions that we should be asking besides that. And that's kind of like where this my model comes in, that I'm trying to bring some like structure to this question of what are the other things around well-being that we should be measuring. So life satisfaction, that usually is like accepted as one part of it. And then these positive emotions, negative emotions, which is part of this Diener's model. Those are usually the next ones which are like, included. But then quite many researchers have been arguing that even that is a bit narrow. But then there's like no consensus at all. What are the other things that should be measuring? But we should be measuring. And there, I'm then like bringing this my model, where I'm trying to argue that we should like these other things that we measure should be based on these human needs and human nature.
Okay, so let's dive in there. Tell us a bit about what, like, one of the things that I really like about your model is that you're trying to really base it on theory. It starts with some of the things that we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation about how one of the things you love to do is ask deep questions. And I feel like one of the things I really like about your model is the fact that it's based on those deep questions. It's trying to come to this question about what is well-being from a theoretical standpoint. So help us understand a little bit about those human needs that this model is based on.
Yeah, but it's like if I think about myself as a researcher, there seems to be a pattern here that that every time I dig into some topic, I start with like coming up with some model that meaningful work. So here's the 3 things that make up meaningful work. Meaning in life. So here's the 3 things that make up meaning in life. Well-being. So here's the 4 things that define well-being. So I don't know. That seems to be like my niche in the
That's right. That's good
community. So the idea is that that when we think about human well-being, we have to start from like understanding what is human nature, and then I argue that there's like at least like kind of like these 4 dimensions of or like ways of being for humans, and one of them is like that we are this what's so-called having. So we are like biological creatures, which means that we have like certain physical needs. So we need water, we need nutrition, we need oxygen to survive. if we don't get those things, we die out quite soon. Without like, if we are not able to breathe, it doesn't take many minutes before we die. So in that sense, like, that's always something that we have to like, remember about human beings, that we're like physical beings with certain physical needs. And because of that, this having is one key dimension of human well-being. But then I argue that,
and I assume just to interrupt quickly, that like that having is similar to what Maslow would have talked about in terms of like a fundamental like safety kind of need. Like we need to feel fundamentally like our very basic needs can be met. We've had Scott Barry Kaufman on this podcast, and he's talked a little bit about the fact that like that's almost like the boat that like the hull that like sits on the water that keeps you afloat on top of the water. You're not going to go anywhere, but if you don't have that fundamental, structure, you're gonna be treading water and drown pretty quickly.
Yeah. This comes from quite much like inspired by Maslow, this physical needs, and it's also this kind of like so-called like deficit need. So we don't think about it much when it's like satisfied. Oxygen is not something I'm thinking constantly about. But when I'm like, if I would be underwater, not able to breathe, then there wouldn't be much other things on my mind. That would be the only thing I would be thinking about: how to get back to the surface, how to be able to breathe again. And the same, of course, that's like the most dramatic case, but then like same goes for like, water, or same goes for like, food. As long as we have them, we might not be thinking too much about them. But then when they're threatened, then we became like quite motivated to do something about that. But that's like, not enough for human life. That we need more than just mere survival. And then that brings us into these other needs and other parts of the model. And one of them is like this, like what I call loving. So one basic fact about human beings is that we are like social creatures. We come into the world, we through other people, and we are like, we learn to know ourselves through other people. So the small babies, they first start like realize that there's other people, and through their expressions, they actually then at one point realize that, hey, they're actually reacted to something, and that something is like me. So like, we first become aware of other people before we become aware of ourselves. So because of that, this social needs is another key part of our well-being. And for example, Maslow had like this loving as one of the needs, but then also like self-determination theory has been talking about this relatedness as one of these key human needs that is contributing to our sense of well-being. And there we can then if you want to make like this more fine-grained distinction, we can say that there might be like few different social needs for human beings. So one of this need to be accepted by the other people. So, like being rejected by other people is usually quite a big fear for us human beings, and we might want to make sure that we are behaving in a way that other people accept us. But that's probably like a bit more like defensive at this defensive need. But then we also want to be like, that other people like care about us, and they're like this like mutual caring relationships in our lives, which is like what this self-determination there is relatedness is special about. And then the third thing I be like myself researching is this sense of pro-social impact, which seems to be quite important for us humans as well, and something that we seem to be derived quite much meaningfulness and well-being from. So there's like lots of research showing that when we're able to do something good to other people, that actually increases our own well-being. Then we have like this having and loving covered, but then I'm argue that also this doing should be something that we recognize as a very basic mode of existence for human beings. So we are not just like passive creatures, but we are like active creatures who are seeking something to do in the world. We are seeking some project for ourselves. We are seeking challenges. We are trying to find something interesting to do in our lives. And because of that we have like these more agentic needs to do things. And here I'm then like using self-determination theory, besides this relatedness, argues for autonomy and competence as these basic needs. And so they are kind of like the agentic needs in our life, that we need to feel this sense of autonomy, that we are kind of like the origin of our actions, that it emanates from our own interests, from our own values, that we are able to endorse our own actions and make these choices as regards our own lives. And then this competence is about this like sense of mastery and being able to accomplish something. So those are kind of like the three modes of existence, which all have like these basic needs attached to them. So this having, loving, and doing. But then I'm like arguing that finally that on a most basic level, we human beings are like, we are experiencing beings. We experience our existence. So we have like this, and some of these experiences are more positive, some of the experiences are more negative. And this brings like this being as one of these modes of existence. And then it's me this being itself then has like two parts, with one of this more affective part, and then one is this more reflective part. And because of that, then like this reflective part is covered by these measures like life satisfaction and meaning in life. And then this affective part is covered by this positive and negative affect. So the kind of like the Diener's subjective well-being model is part of this being in my model.
So I try to play a little bit of that back. We have the having, which are really, those fundamental safety, security needs that are in some ways deficit needs. They shout at us when we don't have them, but when we do have them, they become a little less important, or at least salient. And then we have these other needs like loving and doing, which are really in many ways about who we surround ourselves with and what we're agentically trying to do in the world in some way, shape, or form. And then the being sounds a little bit more like it's our evaluation of it all. How do we feel? How do we think things are going in general? It's the way that we know. It's our compass on the boat to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I guess like the being is like the three other modes of excellence are like feeding into being. So like, that having, loving, and doing, all of them are like about these basic needs. And the more these needs are satisfied, the more we feel life satisfaction, the more we feel positive feelings. And through that, like our kind of the being is kind of like the outcome of how much our like having, loving, and doing needs are satisfied.
I really do like this model. I think it's helpful to be able to think about the different kinds of need satisfaction that we have when it comes to well-being. And I'm not sure that we often do that very well when we just focus on dimensions of well-being, whether it's the PERMA model or Carol Riff's model. I mean, obviously, self-determination theory is very much based on human needs as well, but it's so helpful to be able to think about how do we go about satisfying those needs in both subjective and objective ways.
Yeah. And actually, like it also applied to like this employee well-being as well. Like, the same model can be applied in that context as well, because also in the employee well-being space, that sometimes people are measuring job satisfaction, sometimes people are measuring engagement, sometimes people are measuring positive feelings, sometimes they're measuring something else. So also within that space, there's like quite many different measures, and I guess like this model can help like to sort out these different things and like put some structure to what are the kind of key components of well-being in general, but also employee well-being in particular.
Yeah, so let's dig in there for a second, and you might not have a good answer, or we might be able to, forge it together a little bit ourselves. But if you were to think about the workplace, what would having look like?
No, I guess like in the workplace, having is a bit like, of course, like having a certain level of salary. I guess like one thing is like that as like these modern office workers, we might like not remember all of this, all of these aspects when we are working. But like many people are working actually in conditions which like where there are these physical hazards to their work. That if they do a wrong movement, they might lose their hand or leg or something like that. And of course, like one of the things that the modern society has done, that we have like all these legislations that there would be like much less of these cases, and there wouldn't be these physical hazards to work. And we got like quite much an improvement to the conditions that the work life was like, for example, 100 years ago.
That's great. So the workplace health and safety folks might be in that having territory. It also sounds a lot like, we've talked on this podcast about the Industrial Labor Organization or the International Labor Organization, the ILO, which is part of the United Nations, talks a lot about decency at work. And so, that's like freedom and security and equity and dignity. Those things seem very much in the having category.
Yeah, yes, like, the having like says like this basic that, that we don't have like these hazards or like this, like that our sense of security is not threatened when we are working, I guess.
That's right.
And then, of course, like in modern office work, like they might be taken for granted, that we might forget that, that it's these things, because like they're so like self-evident part of the work that, when I go to the office, I don't have to worry about, somebody killing me.
And then let's talk about the loving, a word that is interesting often in organizational settings. Some people are a little skittish about talking about love at work, and yet I actually really believe that love at work is an important thing when we think about what love can actually mean, what it can mean to have relationships where we really feel valued and valuable. Maybe Isaac Vilentensky, who has been on this podcast, talks about the ways in which we feel like we matter, and maybe that's a really helpful way of thinking about loving in this particular context.
Yeah, and I feel like loving is a strong word, and we can we can call it like relatedness or something like that, which is like a bit more like neutral and probably like easier to chew in the work context. But yeah, in the end, I guess like as social beings, we need like to have this sense of belonging, this sense of community. And some workplaces are very good at providing that. Some other workplaces are not so good at providing that. And that usually has quite a big impact on people's well-being. So like when people feel that, they belong, when they feel that there's people that other people care about them, or their supervisors care about them, this has quite a like important influence on their well-being. So yeah, I just like saying that, it is quite an important part of our well-being at work as well, that whether we call it loving or something else. But in fact, there's like one PhD student is now starting to work with me, and she wants to like do her PhD exactly on the topic of loving in leadership. And she's like, she wants to do the PhD because like she feels that, that this is the way to influence the world, that, make sure that, loving becomes a word that can be used in the leadership context and in organizations. So
I don't even remember what it means, but it's been so long since I've read it. There was a book called Love Leadership. It's John Hope Bryant, who is the one who wrote it back in 2009. I have not read it. I have no idea about it, but I always love the idea of trying to figure out how do we bring more of a sense of love into the work that we do.
Yeah, and Dirk van Dierendonk, he had like this one paper called like Compassionate Love as a cornerstone of servant leadership. And actually, I've been using that sometimes in my classes. Like I put the students to read that, because like, and I think like the bold title is something I like the fact that, he's like servant leadership. I think like it's a good thing to make the students read about, but I think like especially like when he talks about in the context of compassionate love, it's like something, it's a nice intervention to the usual things that the business students are reading.
Now, of course, the doing seems to be what work is largely about. We already talked about that with regards to purpose. Feels very doing oriented. And you've talked about both impact and growth as key aspects of what doing is all about. Is there anything else that you would think in a work context the doing would relate to?
Yeah, like this need for like competence is something like usually that people are quite like interested about in their work context. That's why people are looking for challenges. If the work gets like too easy, then they start like to think about other options or where should they go. And also like this competence is also about learning, and that's also something like I was talking with this one HR manager of a big company, and she said that like from their internal data they had noticed that that when they had these surveys, in the survey they had like some question about whether people are learning. And she had noticed that was like the first sign to know that before somebody is like going to some other company or when they're like quitting their job, like usually this learning started to drop, that they started to feel that they're not learning so much. So that seemed to be the moment when they think that, okay, I'm no longer learning here. I should go to some next place where I'm able to learn more. So that's something that people are like seeking out in their work life. Opportunity to learn new things, opportunities to grow and master new things.
Let's talk about the being. How would you think about both that effective and evaluative way of thinking about evaluation at work?
So I guess of course, like job satisfaction probably is like the most typical way of measuring employee well-being. And that like taps into this evaluative measure and this being in the work context. So like how satisfied are you with your work in general? So in that sense, like that already is like quite a typical part of any employee well-being survey that is out there, that they usually measure this thing. So in the same way as like life context, like this life satisfaction is usually the most typically asked question, then this job satisfaction in the work context seems to be the most typically asked question.
Nick Marks, do you know Nick? Yeah, so Nick runs this company now at this point called Friday Pulse in the UK, but he's been, he has a strong, long history in thinking about well-being policy in the UK specifically. But what Friday Pulse does is really measure the affective aspect of it. And I mean, Nick asks a very simple question every week, which is, how happy were you at work this week? Which is a way of being able to try to, in a very simple, 5-point kind of emoticon scale, just even think a little bit about that being sense on a much more time-bound way than a job satisfaction level.
And I guess like as regards like surveys, there's always this trade-off, like having a long survey gives you this like more comprehensive picture of the situation. But at the same time, if you want to get like this daily or weekly survey, it cannot be very long. It has to have like only one question or very few questions, because otherwise people don't fill it up. So you can get people to fill up this long survey like once per year. But like if you want to have a monthly or weekly survey, then you have to have it very short. And so it gets like, but then they might like help it having like both, like having this once per year, something longer, and then like every week something shorter might be like the best way about, because then you have like this pulse of how people are doing right now. But then at one point or another, you get also this more comprehensive view how they are doing on these different dimensions.
I really like it. I like the simplicity of the model. It makes me think a lot about Vivek Murthy, the US Surgeon General, has this, I think, really fantastic model that is a workplace mental health and well-being model they developed a couple of years ago now, and captures, I think, a lot of the dimensions of what you've described, and including really thinking about a lot of those human needs that you've also described in that model itself at work. But there's something even simpler about thinking about, okay, do people have what they need? Are people finding a way to exist within either a loving or a relational space? Are people able to do the things that they need to be able to do? Are people ultimately feeling like their being at work is meeting their needs? It's a very elegant model.
Okay, yeah, I have to look into that.
Mm. One more thing I want to ask you about the article that have in press, which is about the relationship between sustainability and well-being. I really liked that kind of final chunk of the paper, and I feel like you and Mike Steger are very much talking about those kinds of things, leading the charge in a positive psychology context in terms of helping us think a little bit more broadly about well-being than just at the individual me level orientation of it. Can you just say a little bit more about the relationship between sustainability and well-being?
Yeah, because like I was just talking with a couple of Finnish politicians about this topic like last week, and we were like agreeing that that in a way, like when we think about the politics, what is the aim of the politics in a country, and we were saying that it seems to be like make sure that the people have like well-being in a sustainable way, that it's like good to have well-being today, but at the same time we have to like do it in a way that it's like make sure that people can have well-being also tomorrow, which of course like brings in the environmental component, because like if we have like certain planetary boundaries and certain like resources, and we have like only one planet, and it only have like this one atmosphere with certain levels of various gases and so forth. So because of that, when we think about well-being today, we have to also think about that, how are we producing it in a way that makes sure that also the next generation can enjoy the same levels of well-being. So I guess like this, sometimes when there's like this talk about sustainability, it's talk about like there's like these 3 dimensions to sustainability, like ecological sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And I kind of like argue that they're not like 3 separate things that can be talked about, trade-off between them, but it's more that, the well-being is kind of like the intrinsically valuable outcome that we are trying to produce. And then the environment provides us with these like, these limits that we cannot transcend because we only have this one planet. And then the economy and also the social institutions are somewhere in between. They're like they're ways of transforming human labor and these environmental resources into well-being. So then we have to think about how are we designing these systems in a way that the economic system and the various governmental institutions that we have are like producing as much well-being as possible within the planetary boundaries.
Mm. It's so helpful for us to be thinking about well-being in this broader context. And again, just going back to the model that you're proposing around having, loving, doing, and being, if we don't have a planet, we can't do any of those things.
Yeah.
Certainly, climate change is going to infect our capacity, our having kind of needs in massive ways over the next, 30 to 50 years. And just the doing aspect of, how do we think differently about, for example, climate change? There's a lot that we can do. And doing so will ultimately get us more connected to land. It involves kind of a broader way of thinking about nature connectedness, which in and of itself will increase our well-being. There's so much that's really helpful about breaking down some of these barriers, and that's just on the environmental side, not thinking about the economic side or the social side.
Yeah, and one of the motivations that in like build this model of well-being is that that currently when we think about the policy context, it's quite much like measures driven. There's certain things that are measured, and then like these are like affect the decisions. And one of the successes of the one of the reasons that the cross-domestic product is so successful is that there's a standardized way of measuring it that every country is doing. So we have like this comparable data about what is the country's GDP now, what was the GDP 10 years ago, how it's compared to other countries. And luckily, in the environmental sphere, we also have like more standardized measures now that what we had like 20 years ago, which is like helping us to like make these policies which are actually more friendly to the environment. Because if you don't measure it, then you cannot advance it. So like better measures for the ecological side, but then we also need better measures for the well-being side. And because of that, we should do this work of like conceptualizing and standardizing these measures so that we would have like these as comprehensive and as standardized measures of well-being as we have in the economic sphere right now. So that's the task. Psychologists.
I feel like that's the start of a whole new podcast. But lest we go there, I just want to thank you, Frank, so much for sharing your wisdom and for being able to enlighten us to think deeply about these topics, but also think pragmatically about how we can actually put them into the workplace. I'm very grateful for all the work that you have done, both in the past and in the present, to ultimately help us create more meaning at work and well-being in our lives in general.
Yeah, thanks. It was an interesting conversation. Always a pleasure to talk about these topics. It's meaningful both on a personal level, but hopefully it also has some positive impact in the future.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.